The morning had begun like any other in the quiet stretches of my farmland, the golden cornfield stretching endlessly under the soft light of dawn, each stalk swaying gently in the cool autumn breeze. I had spent months tending this land, from planting each kernel with meticulous care to ensuring the irrigation ditches ran smoothly, and I had come to know every inch of the soil like the back of my hand. This was my sanctuary, my pride, and the embodiment of years of relentless hard work, sweat, and sacrifice. I walked through the rows of corn with a sense of accomplishment, my boots crunching against the loose earth, and felt that familiar surge of contentment that only comes when you see the tangible results of your labor stretching before your eyes. But the serenity of that morning was deceptive, and I had no inkling of the storm that was about to descend upon my life. The trouble began in the neighborhood long before any flames had leapt from my fields. Karen, the kind of person who seemed to thrive on confrontation and entitlement, had moved into the HOA-run community bordering my farmland. She had a reputation, whispered about in passing by neighbors and delivered with sharp, nervous glances across fences. They called her HOA Karen, a title she wore unself-consciously, brandishing her authority over rules and regulations as though they were extensions of her ego. She took pleasure in minor grievances, often reporting the tiniest infractions as if the world would collapse without her vigilance. And I, a simple farmer with roots deeper than the manicured lawns of her subdivision, had caught her attention from the first moment she laid eyes on my property. It wasn't that she had a legitimate claim to my land or the crops I nurtured, it was that my existence, unbound by the cookie-cutter expectations of her HOA, irked her to the core. I tried to avoid her, initially, taking care to keep my distance and maintain a cordial, if minimal, relationship across the property line. I thought respect and distance might pacify her insatiable need for control, but that hope was naive. Karen wasn't content with mere annoyance, she wanted dominance, a way to bend my life to the rigid and petty rules of her small world. She started showing up unexpectedly near my fields, taking pictures, filming the edges of my property, and muttering about supposed violations that didn't exist. I confronted her once, politely but firmly, explaining that I owned every inch of that land legally and that she had no right to interfere. Her response was a venomous smile, one that promised retaliation, and the first seeds of real fear planted themselves deep in my mind. The air between us thickened, tension crackling invisibly over the boundary lines like an approaching storm. Days turned into weeks, and Karen's intrusions escalated. One afternoon, I found the corner of my cornfield trampled, stalks bent unnaturally, the soil disturbed as though by someone intent on leaving a mark. My heart sank, not because the crops could be replaced, they were insured, but because the violation was personal, a declaration of war against my livelihood. I confronted her again at the edge of her property, voice low and steady, trying to maintain composure despite the fire burning inside me. She laughed, that sharp, grating laugh that always left a residue of anger and unease. She claimed ignorance, feigned innocence, and waved me off with an air of someone untouchable. But I could see it in her eyes, the thrill of defiance, the dangerous amusement at testing my patience, at seeing how far she could push me before I snapped. And then the day came that would forever change the quiet rhythm of my life. I had been in town, running errands and checking on equipment at the feed store, when my phone rang with an urgent, breathless voice I barely recognized. A neighbor, trembling, called to tell me that smoke was rising from my fields. Panic surged through me as I raced toward home, my truck bouncing over the dusty lanes, the familiar landmarks of my property passing in a blur. And there it was, flames licking hungrily at the edges of my cornfield, the golden stalks erupting into a violent, orange inferno that crackled and popped with an almost mocking rhythm. My heart pounded, adrenaline driving my movements as I grabbed my fire extinguisher, my tractor, anything to try and contain the devastation, but the fire was fast, feral, and merciless. The acrid scent of burning vegetation filled my nostrils, choking me as panic gave way to fury, and I realized, with a sinking dread, that this was no accident. This was deliberate. And deep down, I knew exactly who was responsible. By the time I reached the edge of the cornfield, the smoke was thick enough to sting my eyes, and I could see flames devouring row after row of corn as if they had a personal vendetta against me. My stomach turned, not just at the sight of my harvest going up in smoke, but at the knowledge that someone had crossed a line that could not be ignored. I leapt from the truck, heart hammering in my chest, and ran toward the nearest patch I thought I might salvage, swinging my extinguisher wildly, but the fire moved faster than any man could, fueled by dry stalks and an unrelenting autumn wind. In the midst of the chaos, I caught sight of her, Karen, standing at the edge of the subdivision, arms crossed, her face pale but her expression one of unmistakable panic. At that moment, she was no longer the confident, entitled HOA enforcer. She was someone who realized that the consequences of her reckless actions had arrived in full force. The sirens came next, a wailing chorus that seemed almost surreal against the backdrop of burning corn. Firefighters, alert and efficient, leapt from their trucks, hoses unfurling like metal serpents ready to strike. I watched them spring into action, the water hitting the flames and hissing, spectacular bursts of steam, and I felt a mixture of relief and vindication. Karen backed away as the fire crews approached, her earlier bravado replaced by a frantic, desperate energy that was almost comical if the situation weren't so serious. The neighbors had gathered at the edges of their lawns, some calling emergency services, others filming the scene, their cameras capturing the irony of her panic in real time. The truth of what had happened was now undeniable. She had torched my cornfield in an attempt to assert some twisted dominance over me, and the witnesses were everywhere. While the firefighters doused the remaining flames, I confronted her again, this time with a calm so deliberate it cut sharper than any anger I could have mustered. She stumbled backward at my approach, eyes wide and lips trembling as she tried to form some excuse, some denial that might save her from the consequences of what she had done. I let her fumble for words, letting the tension stretch between us like a drawn bow. "Do you understand," I said slowly, each syllable deliberate, "that you just set fire to someone's livelihood?" She shook her head weakly, muttering something about stress and misunderstanding, but her voice lacked conviction. There was no hiding now. The fire trucks, the neighbors, and the evidence of her crime spoke louder than any feeble lie she could muster. I could feel a change in the energy around me. The same neighborhood that had once whispered about her dominance now whispered about her failure, the tables turning in a way that felt almost poetic. I realized, as I surveyed the charred remains of my cornfield, that I had two choices: succumb to rage and lose control, or channel this anger into something that would remind Karen, and everyone else, that entitlement has limits. My mind raced with possibilities, strategies that were meticulous and deliberate, much like the care I had taken with my crops throughout the seasons. This was not the end of the battle, it was only the beginning of a game she had foolishly chosen to play. And I was a man who understood the value of patience, planning, and perfect timing when it came to teaching lessons that could not be forgotten. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long, fiery shadows across the burned cornfield, I stood tall and surveyed the aftermath, my boots sinking slightly into the smoldering soil. Karen lingered on the sidewalk, her arms now pressed tightly to her chest, her entire posture radiating fear and regret. It was a transformation from the powerful, entitled figure I had first met to someone who had been stripped bare by the consequences of her actions. I let her watch as the firefighters completed their work, understanding that the humiliation itself was part of the lesson she needed to learn. And in that moment, I made a silent vow to ensure that she, and anyone else foolish enough to challenge me, would understand that some lines, once crossed, can never be ignored without repercussion. The harvest was damaged, yes, but the truth was still mine to claim, and justice, in whatever form I chose to deliver it, was only a matter of time. The days following the fire were surreal. The cornfield, once golden and full of life, lay in blackened, smoldering ruin, the remnants of my harvest reduced to ash and memory. I spent hours walking through the charred stalks, boots crunching over brittle husks, my mind whirring with a mix of grief and cold, calculated determination. Karen had disappeared after the fire, retreating to the safety of her pristine subdivision, but I knew she was watching, waiting, expecting me to react with uncontrolled anger. I refused. The fire had been a message, but I had yet to deliver the full reply, the one that would ensure she understood exactly what happens when someone dares to threaten my property and livelihood. I began meticulously documenting everything: photographs of the burned fields, timelines of her visits, and every whisper of witness testimony that confirmed her presence near the property on the day of the blaze. Knowledge, I reminded myself, was power, and I intended to wield it like a sword. I started small, testing the waters with subtle actions designed to unsettle her, to make her feel the anxiety she had inflicted on me. I would drive past her home at odd hours, lights on in the truck illuminating the edges of her yard, just long enough for her to notice and retreat indoors. Neighbors began talking, rumors spreading quietly about the mysterious presence that seemed almost omniscient. I didn't care if they suspected it was me. The objective wasn't anonymity, it was psychological leverage. Karen's confidence began to erode in subtle ways. She glanced nervously at her windows, lingered less at neighborhood events, and flinched at every unexpected sound. The power dynamic had shifted, and I reveled quietly in the knowledge that her own fear was now mirroring the dread she had forced upon me during the fire. Then came the day I confronted her directly, not with anger, but with precision. I walked up to her front gate, calm and measured, making sure she saw me before I even reached the porch. Karen's eyes widened in recognition, a mixture of dread and disbelief crossing her features. I spoke softly, deliberately. "You thought you could destroy what I built. But now, it's your turn to feel the weight of consequences." There was no room for argument, no chance for denial. The air around us thickened, heavy with the tension that comes when both parties understand that the stakes are no longer trivial. I could see the shift in her posture, the way her hands tightened against the railing, the subtle shake of her shoulders. She was finally confronted with the reality that she had awakened a storm far beyond her control. Over the next weeks, I enacted measures that were calculated and precise. I installed surveillance cameras along the edges of my property, not to spy maliciously, but to document her movements in case the situation escalated further. I took legal consultations, reviewing every possible avenue for action, ensuring that if Karen attempted anything again, she would face consequences that extended beyond embarrassment. Meanwhile, I rebuilt the parts of my cornfield that were salvageable, planting new rows, nurturing the soil with the same dedication I always had. But every seed I planted carried a silent message: I do not forget, I do not forgive recklessly, and I am always prepared to defend what is mine. Karen's occasional glances from her windows reminded me daily that my actions had already begun to resonate, that fear, once unfamiliar to her, had now become part of her life. The beauty of this retaliation, unlike the fire she had set, was that it wasn't destructive, it was empowering. I reclaimed control of my life and my property while ensuring that Karen experienced the consequences of her reckless behavior. The neighborhood began to murmur about her growing apprehension, her once domineering presence now subdued by the knowledge that she had underestimated someone who refused to be intimidated. Each day, as I walked through the newly sprouting corn, I felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond mere vengeance. It was a reclaiming of dignity, a lesson that entitlement has boundaries, and that crossing those boundaries invites consequences that can't be escaped. Karen had ignited chaos in my life, but in return, she had set the stage for a reckoning she would never forget. By the time I moved into the phase of the plan that would truly unmask her, I had become fluent in patience. Patience had been my ally through years of planting, weeding, and waiting for rains that sometimes never came, and now it served me in a different theater, one where every action needed to be measured, every reveal timed to hit hardest. I began by compiling a dossier so thorough it made me sick to think she had forced me into such measures: time-stamped photos from the cameras I'd mounted on rusted poles along the property line, audio recordings of her tirades captured by a neighbor who'd grown tired of her bullying and gladly lent his lawn chair ear, receipts and repair bills showing the damage she'd caused in the days before the fire, and witness statements from 3 separate neighbors who'd seen her pacing and taking notes near the edge of my field in the days leading up to the blaze. I sent copies to the county sheriff with a succinct cover letter that left nothing to inference, then to my attorney, then, because I wanted the weight of public scrutiny to take hold, to the local paper. The moment a reporter came by, notebook in hand and curiosity sharper than pocket knives, Karen's composure began to crumble in ways the fire never had the chance to. She could feign anger and indignation in private, but under a bright light and the pointed questions of someone who wanted the truth, her lies started to look like what they were, flimsy, desperate, and ridiculous. The HOA tried to protect her at first. Old habits are hard to break, even when the evidence sits on their kitchen tables like stubborn plates that won't wash themselves. They claimed jurisdiction where none existed, called meetings to deflect, to frame the story as neighborhood drama rather than arson. That misstep was an opening I hadn't anticipated but welcomed. I sent them the photographs and the official incident report from the firefighters who'd been on my land that day, and then I watched as their board members shuffled papers nervously and realized their own liability if they continued shielding a woman who had, on record, set a man's crops ablaze. Calls went out from the HOA president, first curt, then pleading, and suddenly the neighborhood's tone shifted from, "She's always been a stickler," to, "Were we wrong to let this go on?" The sheriff's office opened a formal investigation. Detectives came with clipboards and a calm that contrasted sharply with the wildfire chaos I'd lived through. They interviewed me for hours, and I told them everything with the same blunt honesty I applied to driving my tractor or negotiating seed purchases. No embellishment, no theater, just facts laid out like rows in a field. Karen, seeing the walls close in, became a caricature of panic. She started sleeping with the lights on. I heard later from a neighbor who used to water her plants at midnight because she claimed she couldn't make it down the stairs without a helper. Her friends in the subdivided cul-de-sac began to avoid her, awkwardly at first, stopping conversations mid-sentence, changing parties' venue to private venues where her name wouldn't be mentioned, and then with outright refusal when she called begging for a sympathetic ear. She slipped into petty acts of sabotage against those who wouldn't shield her, a missing mailbox here, garbled HOA minutes there, but the veneer of power had long since cracked. I watched all of this quietly, because there's a cruelty in revenge that I didn't want to adopt. My goal was not to break her into nothing, it was to make sure she understood that entitlement that crosses into criminality demands accountability. When the county filed charges, when the possibility of an arson conviction hung over her life like a thundercloud, I felt a cold satisfaction that had nothing to do with schadenfreude and everything to do with balance being restored. But justice, as I learned, is a strange animal. It takes forms that are surgical rather than theatrical. At the arraignment, the courtroom smell of old wood and paper felt oddly like the feed mill on a winter morning, familiar, sharp, and grounding. Karen's face in that fluorescent light was not the mask she wore on her porch anymore. It was smaller, more human, and not because I had wished it so but because the machinery of consequence had a way of reducing all of us to our actions. I sat through the proceedings like a farmer at a harvest festival, watching the butchering and the measuring and the inevitable sorting. What could be saved, what was lost forever. The judge read facts aloud, and they landed like precise blows. Her presence near the field captured on timestamps that matched the deputy's statements, the accelerant found in a container with her fingerprints, the neighbor who'd recorded her trembling confession the night before the fire when she'd been sure no one could hear. She tried to speak, to apologize in a way that she no doubt thought would be performative enough to sway pity, but the apology was thin, eaten by the gravity of what she'd done. It wasn't sympathy I felt then. It was the validation of rightness, like plowing a furrow straight and true and seeing the seeds sit exactly where you meant them to. The fallout rippled outward. The HOA faced lawsuits for enabling harassment. Karen's job at the municipal office evaporated under the weight of media attention and internal investigations, and the neighborhood, once neatly manicured and smug, had to reckon with how easily they'd allowed entitlement to fester. People who'd once admired her neat hedges and immaculate mailboxes began asking awkward questions about how quickly they had excused her temper because she'd written a newsletter or chaired a committee. The real victory for me, beyond restitution checks and insurance settlements that would eventually be negotiated, was the way the balance of dignity returned to my life. I could walk the boundaries of my property without someone's gaze calculating how to wound me, and I could stand in my fields, planting again, knowing that I hadn't bowed to intimidation. Yet the lesson lingered like frost on early corn, a reminder that the world will sometimes push you to defend what you love, and when you do it with clarity and legal authority instead of blind rage, you win more than you lose. There were nights, in the slow cool after the work was done, when I'd walk the newly green rows and think about the oddness of human pride, how quickly it can harden into violence under the wrong conditions, and how necessary it is to meet it with both firmness and proportion. I never sought to humiliate for sport. The humiliation that fell to Karen was a byproduct of choices she made, not a trophy I had pursued. Still, watching her shrink from her own shadow taught me that sometimes the only language certain people understand is consequence, clear, unavoidable, and permanent. In the end, my corn grew back, stalks taller and more resilient for the care they'd been given, and the harvest that followed tasted a little of ash and a lot of vindication. Life resumed its rhythms, tractor at dawn, tending the soil, mending fences, and while the scars of that season remained, they were reminders of a boundary I had drawn and defended, of a truth that had been spoken loudly enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. Entitlement is not a license to destroy, and if you try to torch someone's life, you should be prepared to watch the flames reflect back onto your own. The following year, my cornfield stretched greener and taller than it ever had, a living testament to resilience and persistence, and I walked through it with a quiet pride that no one could undermine. The air smelled rich with earth and growth, and I felt an almost spiritual connection to the land that had been tested and had survived. Karen's presence in the neighborhood had diminished to near invisibility. She had retreated into a life shrouded in caution, avoiding any confrontation, her previous arrogance replaced with a wary, nervous gait whenever she crossed paths with me. Neighbors who once whispered about her power now whispered about her downfall, often glancing toward my fields as if acknowledging a subtle victory that had been earned, not stolen. I didn't gloat, that wasn't the point. The point was restoration, of life, of property, of balance. Every stalk of corn, every furrow I plowed, every seed that sprouted anew was proof that deliberate, patient effort could overcome recklessness and entitlement, that justice could be delivered not in blind anger but through persistence, strategy, and a refusal to be intimidated. With the HOA's influence waning and Karen's audacity thoroughly checked, life returned to a rhythm that felt natural once more. I spent long afternoons in the field, hands buried in soil, tending crops with the satisfaction that comes from working not only with one's hands but also with one's mind. The incident with the fire, the panic of the firefighters at Karen's doorstep, and her eventual legal and social consequences became stories I would recount sparingly, often as lessons rather than tales of vengeance. There was a sense of calm that came with knowing I had confronted injustice directly, that I had defended what was mine without losing control or dignity. And though the memory of the blaze occasionally lingered, it was no longer a wound but a reminder that vigilance and persistence can convert even devastation into triumph. The community learned, too, though perhaps in smaller ways, that entitlement has limits, that appearances and authority do not guarantee immunity, and that actions always bear consequences. Karen's transformation, from a dominant, overconfident presence to a figure of caution and retreat, was proof that recklessness and cruelty could be countered effectively. It was not about revenge for its own sake, it was about asserting boundaries, enforcing respect, and reminding others that property, effort, and life itself are not to be trifled with. Her panic, once a source of irritation, became an instrument of validation for every hour I had invested in my land, every drop of sweat spilled under the sun, and every choice I had made to defend my harvest with patience and strategy rather than impulse. In the evenings, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the golden light bathed the field in warmth, I often paused, leaning against the side of my tractor, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. The fire that had threatened to consume my livelihood now existed only in memory, tempered by lessons learned and victories quietly secured. I realized that true power does not come from intimidation, entitlement, or fleeting anger. It comes from knowledge, preparation, and the courage to act decisively when the moment demands it. Karen's actions had forced me into a position I hadn't sought but ultimately strengthened me, teaching me that standing firm and responding with intelligence and strategy can transform even adversity into triumph. And as the harvest matured, the rows of corn standing tall and unyielding beneath the endless sky, I felt a sense of completion, of justice, and of peace. My property, my labor, and my life were intact, not because chaos hadn't come, but because I had met it with clarity, patience, and resolve. Karen, with her panic, her legal troubles, and her diminished influence, was a reminder that entitlement has limits, and that anyone foolish enough to cross those boundaries may find themselves facing consequences far beyond what they imagined. In that quiet, golden field, surrounded by the fruits of my labor, I finally understood the true power of persistence, vigilance, and unwavering commitment to defending what is rightfully mine, knowing that some lessons are best learned through fire, reflection, and the unyielding march of time.